Sarah Mitchell had always been different from other women in her small Montana town. While most girls her age were learning to cook and sew, she was out in the fields with her father, learning to handle firearms. Her dad, a former military sniper, taught her that a gun wasn't just a weapon. It was an extension of your mind, your focus, and your determination. By the time she turned 25, Sarah had already made a name for herself in local shooting competitions. She could hit a target from distances that made grown men shake their heads in disbelief. Her reputation spread through the mountain communities like wildfire, and soon people were traveling from neighboring states just to see the woman who could shoot like a ghost. The Hells Angels chapter in Billings had heard the stories too. They didn't believe them. Led by a man called Iron Mike Thompson, these bikers had their own reputation to maintain. They were known for their wild parties, their dangerous rides through the mountains, and their complete disrespect for anyone who wasn't part of their brotherhood. The idea that some small-town woman could outshoot any of them was laughable. It was a hot summer evening at Murphy's bar when the two worlds finally collided. Sarah had stopped in for a quiet drink after a long day at the shooting range. She was sitting alone at the bar minding her own business, when the rumble of motorcycle engines filled the parking lot. 12 members of the Hells Angels walked through the door, their leather jackets creaking, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Iron Mike spotted Sarah immediately. He'd heard about her from other bikers, and he couldn't resist the opportunity to put her in her place. He approached her table with a swagger that had intimidated countless people before her. His crew gathered around, forming a circle that blocked her exit. The entire bar fell silent, sensing that something big was about to happen. "So you're the famous Annie Oakley we've been hearing about," Iron Mike said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Sarah looked up from her drink, her green eyes calm and steady. She didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of fear or intimidation. This only made Iron Mike more determined to break her confidence. "I hear you think you can shoot better than any man," he continued, pulling out a thick roll of cash from his jacket pocket. "Well, sweetheart, we've got $10,000 that says you can't beat us in a real shooting contest. Not some carnival game, but real competition between real shooters." The bar erupted in whispers. $10,000 was more money than most people in that town saw in a year. Sarah took a slow sip of her drink, considering the offer. She knew this wasn't just about money or marksmanship. This was about respect, about proving that she belonged in a world that had always told her she didn't. "What kind of contest?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent bar. Iron Mike grinned, thinking he had her interested. He explained his proposal, a long-distance shooting competition the next afternoon. Each contestant would get 3 shots at a target placed 800 yards away. The best shot would win the money and the bragging rights. Sarah stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. She was tall for a woman, nearly 6 feet, and her presence commanded attention even in a room full of hardened bikers. "Make it interesting," she said, looking Iron Mike directly in the eyes. "If I win, you and your boys leave this town and don't come back. If you win, you keep your money, and I'll admit publicly that women don't belong in shooting sports." The stakes had just gotten much higher than anyone expected. Iron Mike felt the eyes of his crew on him, waiting to see how he would respond. His reputation as a leader was on the line now. He couldn't back down without losing face, and backing down from a woman would be even worse. "Deal," he said, extending his hand. Sarah shook it firmly, her grip surprising him with its strength. "Tomorrow at 3 o'clock up at the old quarry. Bring your best rifle and your best excuses, because you're going to need both." As the bikers filed out of the bar, the regular customers began talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Word spread quickly through the town that Sarah Mitchell had just accepted a challenge that could either make her a legend or destroy her reputation forever. Nobody slept well that night, knowing that the next afternoon would bring a confrontation that would be talked about for generations. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Montana landscape, but Sarah Mitchell was already awake. She had spent the night cleaning and preparing her rifle, a custom-built .308 Winchester that her father had given her on her 18th birthday. Every component had been carefully selected and precision-tuned over the years. The barrel was match-grade, the trigger was set to break at exactly 2 pounds, and the scope had been zeroed to perfection through countless hours of practice. Sarah's father, Robert Mitchell, had passed away 3 years earlier, but his lessons echoed in her mind as she worked. "Shooting isn't about the gun," he had always told her. "It's about understanding yourself, your environment, and your limitations." Master those 3 things and you can master anything. As word of the challenge spread through town, Sarah found herself at the center of attention she had never wanted. People knocked on her door throughout the morning, offering advice, support, and in some cases, betting money. The local sheriff, Tom Bradley, stopped by around 10 o'clock to make sure she understood what she was getting into. These aren't good men. Sarah, Sheriff Bradley warned her as they sat on her front porch. Iron Mike has a violent history and his crew follows his lead. If you embarrass them today, there could be consequences beyond just winning or losing a shooting contest. Sarah appreciated the sheriff's concern, but she had made her decision. Tom, I've been preparing for this my whole life without even knowing it. My father didn't just teach me to shoot. He taught me to stand up for what's right. These men think they can intimidate anyone they want, but someone needs to show them they're wrong. Meanwhile, across town at the Hells Angels temporary camp, Iron Mike was having doubts of his own. His lieutenant, a scarred man known as Razor Rodriguez, had done some research on Sarah Mitchell. What he found was troubling. She had won every shooting competition she had ever entered, often by margins that seemed impossible. Her longest confirmed shot was 200 yards, made during a demonstration for military recruiters. Boss, maybe we should reconsider this bet, Razor suggested quietly, away from the other members. This woman isn't just some local wannabe. She's the real deal. 10,000 is a lot of money to lose, and our reputation will take a hit if we get beaten by a woman. Iron Mike's jaw tightened. He had built his reputation on never backing down from a fight, and he wasn't about to start now. I don't care if she's Annie Oakley herself, he growled. No woman is going to make fools out of the Hells Angels. Besides, we've got advantages she doesn't know about. The advantages Iron Mike referred to were subtle but significant. He had chosen the old quarry as the shooting location because he knew the wind patterns there. He had also selected the afternoon timing specifically because the sun would be in the shooter's eyes for anyone firing from the traditional position. Most importantly, he had brought his own rifle, a military-grade sniper weapon that he had acquired through questionable means. As the afternoon approached, both sides made their final preparations. Sarah loaded her gear into her pickup truck, including her rifle, ammunition, and a small toolkit for last-minute adjustments. She also brought something else, a worn leather journal that contained all of her father's notes about long-distance shooting, including detailed information about reading wind conditions and compensating for environmental factors. The Hells Angels convoy roared through town just after 2 o'clock, their engines echoing off the buildings like thunder. Citizens lined the streets to watch them pass, many following behind in cars and trucks to witness the showdown. By the time both parties reached the quarry, a crowd of nearly 200 people had gathered. The quarry was an abandoned limestone pit that had been carved into the mountainside decades earlier. It provided a natural amphitheater with clear sight lines and a safe backdrop for the shooting competition. Someone had already set up a target frame 800 yards away, positioned at the far end of the quarry floor. Iron Mike stepped out of his truck and surveyed the scene with satisfaction. Everything was going according to his plan. The wind was swirling unpredictably through the quarry. The afternoon sun was creating difficult lighting conditions, and the crowd was clearly divided between those supporting Sarah and those who had come to see her fail. Sarah arrived quietly, parking her truck away from the crowd. She took her time unloading her equipment, methodically checking each item twice. As she prepared her rifle for the competition, she noticed something that made her smile slightly. Iron Mike had positioned himself and his crew upwind from the shooting position, meaning they would kick up dust and debris that could affect her shots. It was a small thing, but it showed her that they were trying to gain every possible advantage. The competition rules were simple but decisive. Each shooter would get 3 shots at the target from a prone position. The target was a standard bullseye with scoring rings, but Iron Mike had added his own twist. The winner would be determined by the single best shot, not the total score. This meant that one perfect shot could overcome 2 mediocre ones. As 3 o'clock approached, the tension in the quarry became almost physical. Sarah knelt beside her rifle, making final adjustments to her scope while studying the wind flags that had been placed at various distances along the range. The flags were dancing wildly, indicating shifting wind patterns that would make accurate shooting extremely difficult. Iron Mike walked over to where Sarah was preparing, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Last chance to back out, lady," he said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. Save yourself the embarrassment and admit that this game is for men only. Sarah looked up at him calmly, then returned her attention to her rifle. I appreciate your concern, she replied quietly, but I think I'll see this through to the end. The crowd fell silent as Sheriff Bradley stepped forward to officiate the contest. He had brought binoculars and a spotting scope to call the shots, and 2 local men would serve as witnesses to ensure fairness. The target, visible as just a white speck in the distance, seemed impossibly small against the rocky quarry wall. Iron Mike had won the coin toss and chose to shoot first. This was a psychological tactic. He wanted to set a high standard that would put pressure on Sarah. He positioned his military-grade rifle on a bipod and settled into a prone shooting position. The weapon was clearly superior to most civilian rifles, with advanced optics and a heavy barrel designed for precision shooting. The first shot from Iron Mike's rifle cracked like thunder through the quarry, echoing off the stone walls. Through the spotting scope, Sheriff Bradley could see that it had hit the target's outer ring. A decent shot considering the difficult conditions, but not exceptional. Iron Mike seemed satisfied, nodding to his crew who responded with cheers and whistles. His second shot was even better, landing closer to the center of the target. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Iron Mike was proving that he wasn't just talk, he genuinely knew how to handle a rifle. His third and final shot hit near the edge of the bullseye, earning genuine applause from even those who were rooting against him. Not bad for a weekend warrior, Iron Mike announced as he stood up and dusted off his leather jacket. He walked over to where Sarah was lying prone behind her rifle, studying the wind flags with intense concentration. Your turn, sweetheart. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly. Sarah ignored his taunts and focused on reading the conditions. The wind was swirling in complex patterns, changing direction every few seconds. She had learned from her father that successful long-distance shooting was more about patience than pure marksmanship. Sometimes you had to wait for the right moment, even if it meant looking hesitant to observers. She settled into position behind her rifle, adjusting her body until everything felt perfectly aligned. Her breathing slowed to a steady rhythm as she peered through the scope at the distant target. The crosshairs danced slightly as she tracked the wind patterns, waiting for a brief window of stability. Her first shot surprised everyone with its timing. Just as it seemed like she was taking too long to shoot, her rifle fired with a sharp crack. The bullet's flight seemed to take forever, but when Sheriff Bradley called out the result, the crowd erupted in amazement. The shot had hit the inner ring of the bullseye, significantly better than any of Iron Mike's attempts. Iron Mike's expression darkened. He had expected Sarah to be nervous and make mistakes under pressure, but she seemed completely calm and in control. His crew, which had been laughing and joking moments earlier, now watched in tense silence. Sarah's second shot was even more impressive. This time she waited nearly 2 minutes before firing, ignoring the impatient murmurs from the crowd. When she finally pulled the trigger, the bullet found its mark even closer to the center of the target. Sheriff Bradley had to look through the spotting scope twice to confirm the placement. That's a near-perfect shot, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the quarry. I've never seen anything like it at this distance. The crowd was now completely focused on Sarah. Even the Hells Angels members were watching her with grudging respect. They had come expecting to see their leader humiliate a local woman, but instead they were witnessing a display of marksmanship that bordered on the supernatural. For her third and final shot, Sarah took even longer to prepare. She understood that this shot would determine not just the outcome of the contest, but her future in the town. If she failed now, Iron Mike and his crew would never let her forget it. If she succeeded, she would prove once and for all that skill and determination mattered more than intimidation and bluster. The wind flags were behaving erratically, shifting direction every few seconds in the swirling air currents of the quarry. Sarah watched them patiently, looking for a pattern or a brief moment of calm. Minutes passed. Some people in the crowd began to shift restlessly, wondering if she was losing her nerve. Iron Mike sensed an opportunity to disrupt her concentration. "What's the matter, lady?" he called out loudly. "Getting cold feet? Maybe you should just admit that beginner's luck has run out." Sarah didn't respond, or even acknowledge that she had heard him. Her world had narrowed to just the rifle, the target, and the wind. She had learned from her father that the most important skill in shooting wasn't pulling the trigger, it was knowing exactly when to pull it. The moment came suddenly. All the wind flags along the range dropped simultaneously, indicating a brief period of calm air. Sarah's breathing stopped at the natural pause between breaths. Her finger tightened on the trigger and the rifle fired. The sound of the shot seemed different somehow, crisper and more decisive than the previous attempts. Everyone in the quarry held their breath as they waited for Sheriff Bradley to call the result. He was looking through the spotting scope for what seemed like an eternity, adjusting the focus and looking again. Finally, he lowered the scope and turned to face the crowd. His expression was one of complete amazement. "I need someone else to confirm this," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I can't believe what I'm seeing." Two other men took turns looking through the spotting scope, each one reacting with the same expression of disbelief. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as people demanded to know what had happened. Finally, Sheriff Bradley found his voice again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "that shot didn't just hit the bullseye. It hit the exact center of the target so perfectly that it tore the bullseye completely in half. I've been shooting for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like it." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Sarah remained in position behind her rifle, still focused on the distant target. She had made the shot she needed to make, but the real test would be how Iron Mike and his crew responded to their defeat. The silence that followed Sheriff Bradley's announcement was deafening. Iron Mike stood frozen, staring at the spotting scope as if willing it to show a different result. His face had gone from confident smugness to pale shock in the span of seconds. The other Hells Angels members looked between their leader and Sarah, unsure of how to react to something none of them had expected. Sarah finally rose from her shooting position, carefully safing her rifle and beginning to pack her equipment. Her movements were calm and methodical, showing none of the triumph or excitement that the crowd might have expected. She had accomplished what she set out to do, but she understood that the real challenge was just beginning. "That's impossible," Iron Mike muttered, grabbing the spotting scope from Sheriff Bradley's hands. He peered through it himself, adjusting the focus desperately. The target was clearly visible in the distance, and the evidence was undeniable. Where the bullseye had been, there was now a jagged hole that split the center ring perfectly in half. "You cheated somehow," Iron Mike accused, spinning around to face Sarah. "Nobody makes a shot like that. You must have rigged the target or bribed someone to move it closer." His voice was rising with each word, and his crew was beginning to close ranks around him. Sheriff Bradley stepped between them, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Mike, there were over 200 witnesses here today. The target was set up in plain sight by neutral parties, and the distance was measured by 3 different people. Sarah Mitchell won this contest fair and square." The crowd was growing restless. Some people were cheering for Sarah's incredible shot, while others were watching the Hells Angels nervously, sensing that the situation could turn dangerous quickly. Iron Mike was known for his violent temper, and losing face in front of so many people was exactly the kind of thing that could set him off. "I don't care what anyone says," Iron Mike snarled. "I'm not paying $10,000 to some farm girl who got lucky, and I'm sure not leaving town because of one lucky shot." He turned to his crew, looking for support. "Boys, what do you say we teach this town some respect?" But Iron Mike was surprised to find that his crew wasn't as eager to follow him as usual. Razor Rodriguez, his lieutenant, stepped forward with an expression of resignation. "Boss, we all saw what happened here today. She beat us fair and square. If we don't honor the bet, we'll lose respect from every biker club from here to California." Other crew members nodded in agreement. They were tough men who lived by a code that valued strength and honor above all else. What Sarah had demonstrated wasn't just superior marksmanship. It was the kind of mental toughness and skill under pressure that they respected. Regardless of who possessed it, Iron Mike found himself increasingly isolated as more of his crew sided with Razor. The realization that he was losing control of his own men in front of hundreds of witnesses was almost as devastating as losing the shooting contest itself. His face flushed red with anger and humiliation. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, pulling the roll of cash from his jacket. He threw it on the ground at Sarah's feet rather than handing it to her directly. "Take your money. But this isn't over. Nobody makes a fool out of Iron Mike Thompson and just walks away. Sarah looked down at the money for a moment, then back up at Iron Mike. I don't want your money, she said quietly. Keep it. The only thing I wanted was for you and your crew to leave our town alone. And it sounds like some of your men understand that an agreement is an agreement. The gesture surprised everyone, including Iron Mike himself. By refusing the money, Sarah was making it clear that this had never been about personal gain. She was fighting for something bigger, the right of her community to live without intimidation. Razor Rodriguez picked up the money and handed it back to Iron Mike. She's right, boss. We made a deal, and the lady won. It's time for us to move on. He turned to Sarah with something approaching respect in his eyes. Ma'am, that was the finest shooting I've ever seen. Your father would be proud. The mention of her father caught Sarah off guard. She had been maintaining her composure throughout the confrontation, but the unexpected kindness from one of the bikers nearly brought tears to her eyes. Thank you, she said simply. That means more to me than you know. Iron Mike was left with no choice but to accept defeat. His own crew had turned against him. The entire town had witnessed his humiliation, and refusing to honor the agreement would only make things worse. Load up, he ordered his men. We're leaving. As the Hells Angels began preparing to depart, many of the townspeople approached Sarah to congratulate her. Some wanted to know how she had made such an incredible shot, while others simply wanted to shake the hand of the woman who had stood up to the bikers. Local reporter Jenny Walsh was already taking notes for what would become the front-page story in the next day's newspaper. How does it feel to be a hero? Jenny asked, pointing her recorder toward Sarah. I'm not a hero, Sarah replied, shouldering her rifle case. I'm just someone who believes that bullies need to be stood up to, regardless of how scary they seem. My father taught me that the most important battles aren't always fought with guns, but sometimes a gun is the only language that certain people understand. The crowd began to disperse as the sun started to set behind the quarry walls. The Hells Angels motorcycles roared to life, their engines echoing off the stone one final time. As they rode out of town, several of the crew members looked back at Sarah with expressions of respect rather than hostility. But Iron Mike's parting glare promised that their story wasn't finished. He had been humiliated in front of his own men and an entire town. Men like Iron Mike Thompson didn't forget that kind of embarrassment, and they certainly didn't forgive it. 3 months passed quietly in the small Montana town. Sarah's incredible shot at the quarry had become legendary, with the story growing more dramatic with each telling. The local newspaper had picked up the story, and soon reporters from larger cities were calling to interview the woman who had outshot the Hells Angels. Sarah declined most of these requests, preferring to return to her normal life. But Iron Mike Thompson wasn't the type of man to let things go. The humiliation of that day at the quarry had eaten away at him for weeks. He had lost respect within his own chapter, and word of his defeat had spread to other Hells Angels groups across the region. Some members questioned his leadership, and he knew that his position was becoming precarious. On a cold November evening, Iron Mike made his decision. He would return to the Montana town. But this time he wouldn't come alone, and he wouldn't play by anyone else's rules. He assembled a group of 30 bikers from 3 different chapters, all of them men who had their own scores to settle with law enforcement and small-town attitudes. The plan was simple, but vicious. They would ride into town at night, cause enough trouble to draw Sarah out, and then settle the score permanently. Iron Mike had convinced himself that Sarah must have cheated somehow, and he was determined to expose her as a fraud while reasserting his dominance over the area. Sarah had no warning of what was coming. She was at home, cleaning her rifle after a day at the shooting range, when the distant rumble of motorcycle engines reached her ears. At first, she assumed it was just travelers passing through on the highway. But the sound grew louder and more numerous, and soon she could hear individual engines throughout the town. Sheriff Bradley was the first to understand what was happening. He was at the station when reports started coming in of bikers vandalizing property downtown. Cars were being damaged, windows were being broken, and several citizens had been threatened or assaulted. He immediately called for backup from the state police, but he knew it would take time for help to arrive. The bikers weren't randomly destructive. They were systematically targeting locations connected to the shooting contest and its aftermath. Murphy's Bar, where the original challenge had been issued, had its windows shattered. The newspaper office, which had published the story about Sarah's victory, was spray-painted with threatening messages. They were sending a clear message about what happened to communities that embarrassed the Hells Angels. Sarah's phone rang as she was loading ammunition into her rifle. It was Sheriff Bradley, and his voice was tense with urgency. "Sarah, you need to get out of town right now. Iron Mike is back with a small army, and they're looking for you. This isn't about another shooting contest. They want revenge." But Sarah had already made her decision. She could see the glow of fires downtown, and she could hear the screams of frightened citizens. "Tom, I'm not running away while these men terrorize innocent people. My father didn't raise me to be a coward. Sarah, there are 30 of them and one of you. This isn't about courage, it's about suicide. Please just get in your truck and drive to the next county. We can handle this through proper channels." Sarah understood the sheriff's concern, but she also understood something he didn't. The bikers weren't just targeting her. They were targeting the entire community's sense of security. If she ran away now, the message would be clear. Violence and intimidation would always triumph over standing up for what was right. She grabbed her rifle, extra ammunition, and a pair of night vision binoculars that her father had left her. As she prepared to leave the house, she took one last look at the framed photograph of her father on the mantelpiece. "I hope I make you proud, Dad," she whispered. The ride into town was surreal. Smoke was rising from several buildings, and the streets were filled with the sound of breaking glass and shouting voices. Citizens were hiding in their homes, afraid to venture outside. The bikers were using their numbers and reputation to create an atmosphere of complete terror. Sarah parked her truck several blocks away from the main disturbance and made her way toward the center of town on foot. She used alleys and side streets to avoid detection, moving with the stealth her father had taught her during their hunting trips. As she got closer to the action, she could see the full scope of what she was facing. Iron Mike had positioned his men strategically throughout the downtown area. Some were standing guard while others continued the destruction. They had set up roadblocks to prevent anyone from leaving or entering the area. It was clear that this wasn't just random violence. It was a carefully planned siege designed to draw her out. From her concealed position behind a dumpster, Sarah could see Iron Mike standing in the middle of Main Street, shouting challenges into the night. "Where are you now, Sarah Mitchell?" he yelled. "Where's the brave little girl who thought she could embarrass us? Come out and face us like a woman." Sarah knew that she was facing an impossible situation. Even with her superior marksmanship skills, she couldn't possibly confront 30 armed men in a direct battle. But she also knew that sometimes the most effective weapon wasn't the one that fired the most bullets. It was the one that struck at exactly the right moment. She positioned herself on the roof of the hardware store, which gave her a clear view of the entire downtown area. Through her night vision binoculars, she could see every biker and track their movements. More importantly, she could see Iron Mike, who was still standing in the middle of the street like a general commanding his troops. Sarah knew that this wasn't about killing anyone. It was about sending a message that would be heard clearly by every member of the group. She needed to demonstrate that no amount of numbers or intimidation could overcome precision and determination. Her father had always told her that sometimes one perfect shot could accomplish more than 100 missed ones. She settled into position behind her rifle, just as she had done at the quarry 3 months earlier. But this time the stakes were higher than money or reputation. This time she was fighting for the safety and freedom of an entire community. From her position on the hardware store roof, Sarah had a perfect view of the chaos below. Iron Mike was still shouting challenges, his voice echoing off the buildings as his men continued their systematic destruction of the downtown area. She could see that several citizens had been injured, and the volunteer fire department was struggling to contain the blazes that had been set. Through her rifle scope, Sarah studied Iron Mike carefully. He was wearing the same leather jacket from their first encounter, and she could see the angry determination on his face even from this distance. He truly believed that force and intimidation would allow him to control anyone and anything he chose. Tonight she would prove him wrong, but Sarah wasn't planning to hurt Iron Mike. Her father had taught her that violence should always be the last resort, and that the most effective demonstrations of power often involved restraint rather than destruction. She had a different target in mind, one that would send an unmistakable message without causing bloodshed. Iron Mike was holding a beer bottle in his right hand, gesturing wildly as he continued his tirade against the town and its people. The bottle caught the light from the nearby fires. making it clearly visible even in the darkness. It was a small target at this distance, but Sarah had made more difficult shots before. She settled into her shooting position, controlling her breathing as her father had taught her. The wind conditions were different here than they had been at the quarry, but her years of experience allowed her to read the subtle signs automatically. She adjusted her scope slightly, accounting for the distance and the environmental factors. "Sarah Mitchell," Iron Mike shouted again. "I know you're out there somewhere, hiding like the coward you really are. Come down here and face us, or we'll burn this whole town to the ground." Sarah's finger found the trigger of her rifle. She had made her decision. One shot perfectly placed would end this confrontation without loss of life while sending a message that would be remembered for generations. She exhaled slowly, allowing her body to settle into complete stillness. The shot cracked through the night air like thunder, but its impact was surgical in its precision. The beer bottle in Iron Mike's hand exploded into fragments, the bullet passing so close to his fingers that he could feel the heat of its passage. The shock of the impact knocked him backward and he stumbled to the ground, staring at his empty hand in complete disbelief. The effect on the other bikers was immediate and dramatic. The precision of the shot, combined with the fact that Sarah could have easily killed their leader but chose not to, sent a message that was impossible to misinterpret. She wasn't just a skilled marksman. She was someone who possessed the kind of controlled lethality that professional soldiers and law enforcement officers feared. "Holy hell," Razor Rodriguez whispered, looking around frantically to try to spot where the shot had come from. "Boss, she could have taken your head off with that shot. She's telling us she can drop any one of us whenever she wants to." Iron Mike struggled to his feet, his hand shaking as he examined the tiny cuts from the glass fragments. The beer bottle had been completely destroyed, but his fingers were barely scratched. The message was clear. Sarah possessed the skill to kill him from an unknown distance, but she had chosen mercy instead. "Where are you?" Iron Mike screamed into the darkness, his voice now tinged with fear instead of anger. "Show yourself!" Sarah's voice came from the shadows, amplified by a small megaphone she had brought with her. "I'm everywhere and nowhere, Iron Mike, just like justice. You and your men have exactly 5 minutes to leave this town, or the next shot won't be aimed at a bottle." The bikers looked around nervously, realizing that they were completely exposed while their opponent remained hidden. Several of them began moving toward their motorcycles without waiting for orders. The psychological advantage they had enjoyed through numbers and intimidation had been completely reversed by a single, perfectly placed shot. "This isn't over," Iron Mike called out, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. He was beginning to understand that he was facing something beyond his experience, someone who combined superior skill with unshakable moral conviction. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied from the darkness. "You made a deal at the quarry and you broke it. You threatened innocent people, and you terrorized a community that had done nothing to hurt you. This ends now, one way or another." Razor Rodriguez made the decision for the group. "Boss, we're outnumbered by someone we can't see and can't fight. She's got us pinned down from an unknown position with perfect firing conditions. If we stay here, some of us aren't going home tonight." One by one, the bikers began starting their motorcycles and heading for the town limits. They had come expecting to dominate through sheer numbers, but they found themselves outmaneuvered by superior tactics and precision. Iron Mike was left with no choice but to follow his retreating crew.